Tom Jackman, can you start the recording again? There it is. Thank you. Emily, do you have more on this slide, or is there more from the group to talk about on the exclusion list concept? I recognize this is just a, your proposal right now, a concept right now for discussion. Certainly got good discussion. We have thoughts about it on the staff level, and sounds like a lot of the members of the RAC do too, which is good. That's the idea here. Anything else on this slide, or you can take it back over and continue with your presentation if there's no further discussion.
Yeah, I'll jump on. I'll jump forward so I can wrap this up in the next 15 minutes. But again, there will be more time for discussion on those exemptions. Absolutely. And I will also make sure, Tom and Max, that I send out those slides because they have all the references in the bottom there. So that way people can click through some of that on their own too. So that's our table A. So when you think about the tables that I'm going to talk about, that's table A. Table B, and again, just letters so that we didn't mix them up with tables 1 and 2 and start getting ourselves really confused. So table B would be the opposite of the exemptions list, right? So table B, these are the wastes where we say, okay, we know that these have higher levels of radioactive material in them, or higher concentrations of radioactive materials in them. So we want to make sure that we test all these types of things before they come in. So these are the types of things you'd expect to see. Filter socks were a big one, baghouse dust, off-spec zircon products. So some zircon products are included in here. Things like filters and membranes, those types of things tend to concentrate radioactive materials. So all of those will be considered. So what would happen is, and this is not intended to be exhaustive, just like A wasn't necessarily intended to be exhaustive either. Both of these tables are our first cut at what do we mean by what should be exempt and what should not be exempt. So up for discussion on other things that should go on this list as well. And so what do you do with these two lists, right? This table A and table B, what do you do with these two lists? So ultimately, characterization of your waste comes down to the generator. The person that generated the waste is responsible for adequately and accurately characterizing their waste. So they would fill out a form, excuse me, the generators would fill out a form that described the waste and essentially certify its contents. And so if the waste is not on table A, but it is on table B, so it's not an exempt list, but it is on this list of stuff we think might be of concern, then the generator has to take a representative sample and send that off to the lab for analysis. They'd probably do a gamma spec on that sample, which is consistent with what we do now. And then what happens at that point, either the generator themselves, the disposal facility they want to send the material to, or they could hire someone, it doesn't matter who really, would review that data. So they would review the lab data and they would compare those results against two new tables. One would be table C, an exempt norm and T-norm concentrations table, and that would be very similar to what our table 1 in the Oregon rules currently looks like, with some updated values and things like that, but it would look very similar. And then there would be a table D, which is a maximum concentration limit. So again, that's our upper limit of you can't go over that no matter what. And you can't go, and then so sometimes somewhere between table C and table D are where we want to dispose of these wastes, but we need to track them. So really, there's three things that can happen here. One is if you're less than that table C exemption values. So if you test your material and it comes back as less than that, just say 5 picocuries per gram of radium-226, which is the current exemption, then they're exempt from this disposal prohibition, and you would carry on your merry way and dispose of the waste with no tracking and no other concern outside of any chemical concerns, no other concern about the radioactive part of it moving forward. That's the easy one. If you're greater than table C, but less than table D, so you're above that exempt limit, but you're below the maximum limit, then you could dispose of your material in Oregon with disposal facility approval and tracking. And we'll come back to that, what that looks like. If you're above table C and above table D, then that waste can't be disposed of in Oregon. It would be considered radioactive and it would have to go out of the state. And this is a lot of words. It will get put into a flow chart or something so you can kind of see the decision process once we iron out the details. But that's essentially what happens on the generator side. On the disposal facility side, again, no one's trying to force landfills to take this material. You can elect to not take this material. And we can figure out what that looks like from in the future. And then disposal facilities can accept or reject these materials. So the disposal facility rejects the waste stream. They don't have enough room in their inventory, or they don't want to take it. Then the waste has to go to an alternative facility within the state, or it has to just go out of state, right? Those would be your two options. If your waste is accepted by the disposal facility, then the disposal facility operator has to check their inventory limits. So that's a little bit about what we talked to with Tom Jackman's question, which is, how do we do that? So that composite sample would be assumed to be representative. It would be representative of the entire waste stream being disposed of. That would get put into their inventory tracking system. They would say, yep, we're still below our inventory. We can take your waste. The waste would come in, get disposed of. Everything would be recorded. The concentrations would be recorded, again, of those key nuclides, and the total waste mass would get recorded. And all that information would go into an annual report that would have to get produced by facilities that accept TNORM. And so I won't read all of these, but this is the other thing I was getting at too, of this is going to eliminate some landfills right off the bat. These are generic disposal facility requirements from the Association of State and Territorial Solid Waste Management Officials, or ASTSWMO. So they came out, they had a great guidance report. Again, it's linked here, you'll be able to see it, for solid waste managers looking at TNORM specifically. And they had this set of recommendations that we think is an excellent set of recommendations to be included for landfills that want to take this material. The material, the norm and TNORM has to be covered at the end of each day. You have to have, there's a certain amount, total quantity of TNORMs. You can't put only TNORM in your landfill, right? So 10% of or less of the volume in a given cell or in your total disposal facility, things like that. Would be just required for any landfill wanting to take TNORM. And that ensures that everybody's protected and all the landfills are at least on a standard footing that want to take this material. So I think this actually probably eliminates some of the issues with smaller landfills that don't have liners, because we would say that the landfills that want to take TNORM really should have a liner. And so we would figure out which ones of these are must, right, in regulatory speak, and which one of these are should, and which one of these are may, right? So those are the levels of which regulations work in the radioactive world. But again, this is just a generic list of requirements that we altered a little bit, that came from this guidance document. So I suggest it's a good one to take a look at. And then the annual report, right? So these disposal facilities have to take, if they're going to take these materials, they need to produce some kind of annual report, so that we can be so we, the regulator, can be sure that everyone is in compliance and that everyone's protected. So that annual report is going to contain a couple of key pieces of information. One is going to have inventory limits. So whatever your landfill's inventory limits are, those will be listed along with your year-to-date quantities that you've received to date. So everything you received in 2023 would be listed in your 2023 annual report, which gets submitted in early 2024. And that's all tracked and shown. It would also be something that could be looked at any time, right? Because it needs to be kept up to date, but it would definitely get reported in an annual report. You would also need to monitor your leachate and your groundwater. Again, using approved methods for solids and liquids. Liquids are a little bit tricky to sample properly. So there's specific methods you want to use for your liquids to make sure that you're in compliance. And those are called out in the EPA 40 CFR 141.25. So we're not making this up, comes directly from the EPA. And then for the water samples, it's all great to take a sample, but you need to compare it to something meaningful. So there's two additional tables that we would suggest be added to the regulations. One is a table E, which would be our maximum contaminant levels for leachate. So those would be our leachate limits. So you compare your leachate sample results to your leachate limits. And then a table F, which is maximum contaminant levels for groundwater. So you're not drinking the leachate, but someone might be drinking the groundwater. So that's why there's a distinction there. So we'd compare to maximum values, allowable values for both of those. And for groundwater, we'd probably suggest using something like the EPA's MCLs, or maximum contaminant levels, because those are quite conservative and are good benchmarks to use. But we would just put those into this legislation in the proper units and everything so that they're easy for comparison against. Yeah, Jim.
So legislation's not needed. It's already been done, right? And we believe that they have the authority to do all of this. All of these numbers that you're looking at are really founded in the model, right? They all come from the model. So that's how those would be generated. Trying to think, I think that's it. Oh, and this, remember, this is this is part of phase 2, so there's a lot more work to be done on this. Emily's going to go over next steps here, but one of the things we need to add to this is a small landfill on the next steps. So,
yep. All right. Oh yeah, Jamie, please.
I hopefully I'm not jumping ahead, but what about gas collection? So like asbestos and whatnot, is anything being taken into account for like when these materials might be dug up as part of a gas well installation project, or the result of like, if you have leachate seeps, sometimes you have to dig back pretty far into a landfill in order to resolve a leachate seep issue. Has any of that been thought through yet?
We have not looked explicitly at digging into the landfill as part of this work. Risk Assessment Corporation, or RAC, has done several assessments looking at T-norm disposals in landfills in a variety of different locations across the country. And two things come to mind. One is the radiation dose from digging up T-norm materials from landfills is usually quite low just because of mixture with other materials. And I think you'd probably be protected from that limit, like that your whole landfill can't be T-norm. So there's that aspect, the dilution aspect, essentially. And the second thing is we did look at, in one of our analyses, we did look at the methane, or like some landfills produce gas that's used right in the future.
That was the third thing. I'm like, okay, so if you're sucking up the radon, like what does that look like in the gas?
Yeah, so we've looked at that in a landfill in Kentucky, and it was negligible. One thing in general, radon in outdoor environmental settings is not a problem because it gets dispersed really quickly. That, like, mitigation in your house is usually a fan in your basement, right? Or something to increase movement of air. So when you're talking about an outdoor system or something where it's used outside, that's generally not a problem in our experience. Now, it's definitely something that could be looked at more carefully, though. Does that help?
Yeah, so I was thinking more of like, where, and this is down the road, but we track where we place asbestos in landfills. And there's often at these size, like at Arlington size facility, they have GPS locators on the equipment, and you can say like, okay, this is where we're putting our asbestos, or they have asbestos cells. And I was trying to think of like a similar sort of concept or approach so that we don't have exposures more than once of the same material coming in, or it just, or like, what does that look like? And do we need to track it? Or is this stuff at such a low dose that, because I'm getting a little confused with the exemptions and I just want to make sure that I fully understand the entire risk if we're not knowing the levels of the materials that are coming in that are on the exemption list. So I just want to make sure I fully understand what that looks like.
Yeah, so two things, and Dr. Reese, I see your hand is up too. So that I would say, one is and I wish Andy Lombardo was on here, he couldn't make it, but Pennsylvania, I believe, one of the states looked at, should we put all the T-norm in the same spot in our landfill? Is that better? And they ultimately determined that wasn't better, to like have like this cell be the T-norm cell and then everywhere else be other stuff, right? Because of that dilution factor, where if you dig into it later. So I think there's definitely something to be said for how to track this stuff as it goes into a landfill and what's appropriate and what's reasonable. and then the other clarification I want to make is the exemptions list. So whatever ends up being approved from the exemptions list, it's being exempted because it's not hazardous from a radioactive standpoint. I'm not going to speak to anything other than I'll stay in my lane of radioactive hazards, right? It would be at such a level, it would be demonstrated to be at such a level that it's not of concern. So you wouldn't have to track it, and it wouldn't add to your inventory in any appreciable way. And any dose assessment or hazard assessment from it, from a radiation standpoint, would demonstrate that it's not of concern. So the exemptions would be materials that we get, that we prove essentially are not hazardous. So you don't need to track those. They'd be like below the 5 picocuries per gram radium-226 kind of thing, or something where we can demonstrate that even with the variability, it's so unenvironmentally mobile, it's so fixed in its chemical compound that it's not going to get out and give anyone a radiation dose. So that's in that bucket over there. The stuff that is accepted and is tracked as it comes in is totally different, and it would be tracked as you go. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah.
And I'm sure it warrants further discussion. I'm sure it won't answer all your questions.
Because
but
we're tracking it in the model or a spreadsheet or something like that, but are we tracking the location where we place it in the landfill? And I guess that's like a future topic of discussion, if that's even needed, or yeah.
Yeah, I think it's definitely. I think it's worth a further discussion for sure. Steve Reese?
Yeah, thank you. Could you just comment a little bit on the inventory limits themselves?
Yes. Like what they are?
Sure.
Yeah, so the way that we don't have actual final numbers yet, and the ResRad models have been run for generic landfills using mostly default parameters. But until and you'll see, you're jumping right into my next steps, which is getting agreement on the modeling process, and specifically the ResRad modeling and the parameters, because what parameters we put into our model are going to tell us what inventory is going to come out on the back end. So I'm not exactly sure what the inventory limits are going to look like in terms of like curie quantities. I have no idea what they are off the top of my head.
But you're implying that it would be some sort of basically risk-based, right?
Yep, it'd be a dose.
Each one of these is presumably going to be less than 25 millirem. And I would assume to be if it's risk-based, are you shooting for 100 millirem total for the inventory? It seems pretty limiting.
Yeah, 100 millirem for the current worker person. Yeah.
But general public, or 25, that's right, 25 millirem. So is the total inventory going to be based upon 25 millirem then, projected dose?
So there's two limits we're talking about. One is the current person, so you can't exceed 100 millirem for the current person, and then the future person at 25 millirem.
Can we hold that thought for a second?
Okay.
It's time for public comment. So if any members of the public who are not on the RAC want to make a comment, please raise your hand and feel free to do so, and then we'll get back to the conversation afterwards. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone. We will let's get back to the conversation, and in the next 15 minutes or so, if anyone from the public wants to make a comment, just raise your hand and we'll get you on the list.
Yeah.
So just to follow up on that then,
yeah.
I mean, it's basically risk-based. So do you anticipate that, given the experience that you folks have, that you'll be finding that you'll get waste characterized, let's say, close to the limit? Or is it usually like way below the limit? Because I'm envisioning you could have one, if it's risk-based, you could have one truckload of stuff come in and basically limits them out forever, right? Limits the disposal facility out forever.
Yeah, so in theory, I think you're correct. I think where you come into a problem with that is I think in that case, based on discussions with Art Rude, which Art, feel free to jump in.
Oh, yeah.
You would actually bust your worker limit that's standing there. If you had a really hot load come in, you're gonna bust that
Okay.
limit for that person standing there and physically like hanging out there, versus the limit for the future person wouldn't even matter at that point because that worker is then being too exposed. But Art, do you want to
Emily,
add to that?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
So you've got a cap limit on it. You can't expect, let's just use, for example, some ridiculous amount, 10,000 picocuries per gram.
Sure.
Okay, that's not going to be accepted. But something down that's above your, what was it, table A limit, Emily? I can't remember all that.
C, but that's okay.
Okay, C limit, but less than the worker limit. That, if you accept a bunch of stuff on the high end of that, that eats into what your inventory can be. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to stress this, is that the long-term health and safety is really driven by inventory, not just
exactly.
concentration. And as long
Yes.
as we come to that understanding, I think we're in good shape. But that's
I'd agree wholeheartedly. And so I don't have a feel for the kinds of materials that this would involve, whether or not they're bumping you up close to, okay, so you say 100 millirem per year to the workers, the limiting one. Are the loads typically, I just don't have a feel. Are they close to the limit, or are they typically pretty low, such that effectively you can track an inventory? Because I'm envisioning it, you could get one load that's limiting out and it basically wipes out your inventory forever. Or you could have you'd have 100 loads that are 1/100th of the limit, and so you have to track all that inventory where the limit is based upon a risk value.
So based on our experience to date with the pathway exemption materials, which are essentially what will then go into this process, I assume, we see a mixture of materials. Most of them are, and actually I think I can speak more broadly, all of them to date have been below 50 picocuries per gram radium-226. Sometimes the facility, and usually quite a bit below, 10, 20 picocuries per gram radium-226, which we use that as an example for everybody that's not a health physicist, because that tends to be our most limiting radionuclide. So I think for the most part, you're going to see a lot of loads coming in and contributing a tiny percentage towards your inventory. I don't think you're going to find, based on our current knowledge of writing these for a couple of years, I don't think you're going to find one load coming in really hot and maxing out your site's inventory. I think you'd have a different set of concerns in that case. It's a good question, though.
Historically, there have been one or two waste streams that are 100, 125 peaks per gram of radium-226 as well.
But I mean, also the ResRad calculation, which I realize we get details to be discussed later, but that's really the meat of it, because if your limit is risk, ultimately a dose limit, then the devil is in those particular details, because concentrations are less of an issue. I shouldn't say less of an issue, but they're an important subcomponent to the entire model, right? So
absolutely,
that's interesting.
And I think it's a great point, Dr. Reese. I can't help but call you Dr. Reese. It's a great point. And I think the real discussion of this, the nitty-gritty part of this, that some of you may think we've been in the weeds, but we're going to get really in the weeds when we start talking about specific ResRad parameter values and working through that process, because that will ultimately determine what parameter values go into the model, will ultimately determine the concentration inventory limits that come out the back end. So, and that's a detailed conversation that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I think, Dr. Reese, to your point, and to Tom's point, there's probably 2 or 3 waste streams, customers that exceed the limit if they throw away virgin product, right? If they use it in their process, mix it with other ceramics or other things, then that binds it and lowers the overall concentration. So I think depending on the outcome of the model, we're not going to see a lot of things being required to go out of Oregon that are used by industry these days. So hope that answers your question.
Other questions? So, oh yeah, go ahead, Max.
Yeah, and thanks. I think Shirley had a question earlier, but she dropped her hand, but just wanted to give her a chance to speak up if she does. And I also have my own question here. Shirley, there you go. Shirley, you got your hand up. Go ahead. Shirley, you're on mute if you're trying to say something, but if you want to go ahead, Shirley, please dive in.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay, thanks.
The longer I wait, the more questions I have, but I'll try to keep this brief. First of all, I'm a little confused about the applicability of our experience to date if we're looking at implementing a proposal that would include or have ways to include, for example, what's on table A and table B. Loads, in quotes, are going to look quite different under those circumstances. So that's one question, or one, I just like to hear more discussion of that. But the other issue, before the public comment period was announced, Jim said that none of this would require legislation. And if that's truly what you meant, I do have a kind of a question about that. And I know your legal team is looking at this, and I'm not a lawyer, but the proposal appears to me to be headed in the direction of focusing on the means of disposal, the conditions of disposal, rather than the materials per se. And it seems to me that what the law said, including Senate Bill 246, is that if we develop any means of defining waste materials as not radioactive material, they can, by law, be disposed of by anyone, anywhere. So I'd like to hear his the way that this proposal isn't precluded by the current statute.
So do you want me to speak to that first point real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Shirley, that's a great question. I think I do not, and in my opinion, I don't envision a huge shift in what is disposed of in Oregon once these rules go into effect. I think that our experience with the current pathway exemption materials is directly applicable because it's going to be those same materials that are getting disposed of in Oregon under these new rules. So it would just be a different system of tracking them. So that's why I speak using our previous experience as mattering, because those materials and those concentrations are basically what we're talking about here going forward. There will probably be additional materials that get considered as well, but I think the current materials would continue to come in, the current pathway exempt materials would continue to come into the landfills as they currently do.
Not to jump too hard on the soapbox of oil and gas T-norm, it looks to me that at the very least, we could use that as an example of a kind of material that might start coming into Oregon that currently is not lawful and therefore not legally acceptable. And if we open the door to that sort of thing, I think our loads are going to change, as are the sources of those loads, because that kind of waste is always looking for a place to go.
Yep, that's a fair comment. And I think one other thing that I want to say, and then Jim, you can talk, is a lot of there are a number of states that have dealt with this, so Oregon's not alone in terms of trying to figure out how to deal with these wastes and to ensure that Oregon doesn't become a dumping ground for whatever waste comes in, right? That's definitely something that's of concern for every state, especially the ones that surround the oil and gas deposits in the Midwest and the Northeast. So that's definitely something to consider. And we have a lot of experience from other states that we can draw on to make sure that we are being protective. But that's a good point. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I'm gonna say, I don't think when we said oil and gas waste, the elephant in the room is fracking waste, right? We're not proposing that Oregon landfills be able to accept fracking waste. And there's ways within the rules that those can be completely excluded, from being accepted in Oregon. So I'm not sure we need to worry too much about that. We need to address it, but that's not what this phase 2 stuff is looking at. And from the legal standpoint, the way the legislature wrote the law, it says that effectively Oregon can decide what's not radioactive and what is, and the basis for what is and what isn't is if it presents a significant danger to public health or safety. And so we're using models and predictive models that figure out what the danger level, what the risk is to public health and to safety. We've taken into account the current worker, right? The person that's actually helping the disposal of the stuff. And we also take into account the future worker. This really, just kind of solidifies what's happening now, right? In Oregon. A lot of these wastes are being taken into landfills and being disposed, and the risk of these materials when they're in a landfill is much, much lower, than spreading them on the ground. I don't think any forthright person would think it's good to take radioactive or high levels of radiation and spread it on the ground and then live on it. That's just not something that just makes good sense. So anyway, I'll shut up. That answer your question? Surely.
Not entirely. I understand that there is a strong motivation for a workaround, but to me right now, until I hear what legal experts have to say, it seems to me that the operative word in that addition to the definition number 23 for radioactive waste, the operative word is material, not the disposal method or where it ends up. I mean, there's a practical problem I can see that you're trying to solve, but I'm just finding it difficult to see that the law, as currently written, would allow that. I think that I recall from several meetings back that Jeff Burright pointed out, I think it was Jeff anyway, that the law doesn't allow us to talk either back to the oil and gas issue and the fracking dumping. The law doesn't allow us to prohibit the origin of the waste. So that would also, I would imagine, also cover, waste coming from out of state from a process that we don't engage in here. So anyway, I don't want to dominate this conversation, but there's a lot to be heard in the future. Thanks.
Agreed.
Thanks, Shirley. This is Max. I'll just go in here. And yeah, to your point, there is a legal review process that we're undertaking right now. To your first question about the statutory definitions. The second question around can Oregon limit and prohibit waste from other states? I think our working assumption is also that that's not allowable, that you can't limit. It's like an interstate commerce clause kind of a thing. Although to be honest, we probably could look a little closer at that legal issue if that was something of interest to the RAC. There might be some open questions there, but we had asked that question at least a year ago, and I think the answer was probably not. I had an actual question here of my own, in addition to what we've been discussing. Emily, can you talk a little more about the tables A and B distinction and why you settled on the materials on your list right now, and how you're proposing, what you're proposing on those material specifics?
Yeah, definitely. I just want to say one thing too, and I am not a lawyer, but other states do prohibit what comes in from other states. So I don't know if that's like Kentucky, for example, doesn't allow waste from certain states unless they're in their compact. So I don't know if that's something that could be
Is that the
considered.
compact because of the low-level radioactive waste compact states? Is that what they use for their definitions? As we're a member of the low-level radioactive waste compact in the Northwest, but that's waste that's even more, to be low-level radioactive waste is to be more radioactive
one
than
up,
what you're
yeah.
talking about here. Yeah, which is kind of a curious thing. And our
Yeah, it's a
end of
good
waste
question.
goes to the state of Washington, has the Northwest Compact's low-level radioactive waste landfill. And then maybe one other point before you dive in, just from from my perspective on the state agency side, we see the more pathway waste that is Oregon generated right now. It's from Oregon businesses and industries that are generating more of this waste that is looking for pathway exemptions right now. Probably much more than out-of-state waste that we look at, just for context. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you can speak to the A and B tables.
Yes. Art, did you have a comment on the previous thing before I jump into tables A and B? You had your hand went down. Okay. All right. Okay. So table A table A was developed from two places. One is a list of which, again, sorry, you got the PDF, not the PowerPoint file. All these little numbers correspond to a link where that came from. So I didn't invent this list. It came from different states and how different states define what's not radioactive and what is excluded specifically and what's explicitly called out as being excluded. Again, that comes from other states' definitions. Ohio, Kentucky, Montana, Colorado, and North Dakota being the key ones there. Additionally, some of these things come from the EPA, and additionally, some of these things come from a report by the CRCPD, which is the Conference on Radiation Control Program Directors. It's a heck of an acronym. And so essentially that's a loose group of state regulators that get together to talk about issues like this, right, that come up and that are common to states. Every state is sort of in this weird place with TNORM just because the EPA hasn't stepped in to regulate it at a federal level. So different states have done different things. And one of the things, these are things we found in common that different states did, that they excluded these things. A couple of the others, cement dust and the coal combustion and the one of these others that I'm missing came from different peer-reviewed or published studies that showed that the TNORM concentrations in those materials are quite low and are generally not of concern. So when you look at all different types of cement across a variety of different locations, is that something you need to worry about? And the answer was no. And there's published papers on that. Same thing with the wastewater treatment plant and the coal combustion products. Those again came from someone did a study, some poor soul went and did a bunch of wastewater studies and published all of that data and did a risk and dose assessment on that material and said, yeah, it's not a concern. So we can rely on the work that other people have done, other states have done, other federal agencies have done, and other peer-reviewed information that's been published to come up with this list. So that is, that's essentially the process I use to come up with this. A couple of these, the sandblasting waste, those came directly from data that the Chemical Waste Management landfill has looked at. So they had 20 plus different types of sandblasting waste that have been tested at PACE labs, you know, in a certified lab where they did gamma spec on it, and all of those are, you know, way less than, for the most part, less than 1 picocurie per gram radium-226. So rather than continuing to test every single sandblast material that comes in, we have a pretty good set of data that says, yeah, that stuff's all quite low, so we're pretty safe. So that's essentially where this came from. And again, I'll provide you all the references so you guys can go look, and then we can have a more informed conversation about all of this. But essentially that left this stuff as being stuff we know is T-norm. It's not necessarily low, however we define low, in T-norm concentration. So it's stuff we need to think about. Baghouse dusts are an obvious one where we see those in our every pathway exemption we've done, right, has probably a lot of them anyway, have baghouse dust. So those are not necessarily low. So we wouldn't want to exclude those. And same thing with pipe scale. Scale is one of the things that comes out of the oil and gas industry where we really know that's definitely concentrated the radioactive material. And it's definitely something we need to think about. Filter socks, I think, are what started this whole problem in Oregon to begin with, way back in, I don't know, several years ago now, right? Where it was mostly filter socks that were disposed of. And that's not unique to Oregon either, right? This Kentucky had the same thing happen where they took a bunch of filter socks. And the filter socks, again, it's like a filter that goes on the end of a pipe, and it literally looks kind of like a sock. And that concentrates radioactive material. So these are things that we know we should be concerned about. And as for the stuff that's not on these two lists, because again, these clearly don't define every waste stream that goes into an Oregon landfill, those are things where we have to make some informed judgments, and we'll have to figure that out, right? And it just, who knew trash was so complicated, right? I just throw it out in my trash can and it goes to the curb, and I don't think about it again. So I realize that there's nuances here that that Hillary has pointed to, and we've talked about with you guys fairly extensively, that we're going to have to think about. But that was the general rationale for getting A and B, tables A and B.
Okay, thank you. It sounds like a basis of existing scientific studies and knowledge base from your work, plus a couple local examples of product that maybe have come through the waste management system in particular. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
It's for good of the team's knowledge here. On the coal combustion residuals, a couple of years ago when the Boardman coal plant was being shut down, our team worked with Portland General Electric and verified that the ash pile that is going to sit at the Boardman coal plant site in perpetuity is not radioactive waste. It was tested and scanned for radioactivity, and it was below the even the 5 peaks per gram threshold, as I recall. It was quite low. But we did test it, and we did check on it because it was known that product can have radioactivity levels that are depending on the origin of the material. So we've done that before.
Yeah.
Cecilia, go ahead. I think we're probably getting close on our clock here.
Yeah, we got about 20 minutes left on the meeting. So just wanted to speak to a couple things. Jim had mentioned that this proposal is about the same as what we're doing now with pathway exemptions. And I would say yes, but on that. Right now, most of the pathway exempt waste is going to a landfill, but under our rules, if the generator of those pathway exempt wastes could legally dispose of the waste otherwise by land spreading or like, if DEQ would allow that, it wouldn't have to go to a landfill. We have examples of pathway wastes that have been historically land spread and continue to be present and managed accordingly. So just while in practice it is the same, it is not the same in theory. And with regard to the table A, there's always outliers for every industry. And I off the top of my head, I can think of at least 2 sandblast materials that had to go through a pathway exemption process. So you know, I tend to be wary of drawing broad brush generalizations.
Yep, and I think that's fair. I think these all require more discussion and thought to go into them with the RAC and with you guys. I did want to also add to the coal combustion products, Max. It's good to know about the Boardman facility, we also did an assessment of a facility in Tennessee looking at a dose assessment from coal combustion products for the workers at the site that are pushing that stuff around in piles and manipulating the piles and working very close to those materials. And we've calculated doses that were very low. And so that's report has been published as well. And I'll include the reference to that. But that's another line of evidence that those materials don't present a dose hazard. So it's good to know about the Oregon one too.
Emily, do you have anything else in your presentation to go through now? We're at 11:42 on our clock.
I think just to show everybody what the next steps are. So, you know, we've talked a lot about this process, so there's gonna be more discussions. I think to finish up the ResRod modeling and to give you some numbers to talk about, like what concentrations are we talking about here?
Emily, real quick,
yeah.
I took control from you when public comment happened, so you're
Oh.
not sharing right now.
Oh. There we go. Thank you, Tom. So I think, yeah, just this is the sort of a high level summary of where we need to go next. I think having that discussion on the parameter values is another good thing to get on the calendar soon for discussion with you guys on because once we get agreement on parameters and what we want to see, we can do some actual sensitivity cases and start producing some actual numbers to talk about as well. And then producing actual drafts of all these tables that I've labeled with letters in purple. So, and I'm sure there's more steps in here that I've missed, but this is sort of roughly where I think we need to go next. So that was it. That's all I had.
Okay, very good. Yeah, thank you, Emily. Be a last call for questions for Emily right now. Okay, thank you. That was
thank you.
Good information, and I appreciate the presentation there. You know, and a reminder for any other members of the RAC too, if there was a desire to do a similar type of presentation, just let us know. Anybody has the opportunity to present their thoughts on it. Tom, Cecilia, do you want to lead us through the next steps in our process right now?
Yeah. So I guess I'm envisioning we will take another pass through the sort of part one discussion and circulate that around. And then the part two, the pathway or this alternate proposal, we're going to need a little more formal weigh-in from legal folks and leadership to figure out if it's something that we can consider. You know, there's specific language in the FSEC rule set now that says that you can't take credit for mitigating factors or disposal. So it's a heavy lift to convince a 30-year change, and so there'll have to be some deliberation for sure. So it seems like we might need to have another RAC meeting at some point in the future to talk through sort of the part two resolution process. But in the meantime, we'll get some forward momentum done on the part one rules. Unless I'm missing something.
No, I think you're right, Tom. I'd open it up for the RAC for any thoughts, RAC members, any thoughts on that process step. And I have my copy of the draft rules in front of me. And I think what we're looking at is 345 Division 50 0006 up through this section on specific exemptions, which is 0030. And that's what we might consider what Tom presented earlier as part one of the rule set. That would include the 7-day rule right now, or what could be a 90-day rule for temporary holding while material is in transit to a disposal site out of state, a medical waste type of an exemption, updates to the tables, basically the materials that Tom Cecilia presented at the beginning of this meeting. And we would, as we also mentioned, send out probably a slightly revised version from the December version of this part one of the rule set to the RAC members for thoughts and written comments on that, consolidate those materials. And I don't know that we need another RAC meeting on that item, on the part one of the materials, unless somebody feels differently. We would then take that to FSEC, present to FSEC, sort of that part one, look for their, I don't know, it's really acceptance of the process. There's that, what that does at the FSEC meeting is then opens up the public comment period on the draft proposed rules. And then FSEC, after that comment period, FSEC then makes a decision on whatever rules have been put in front of it at that time. While simultaneously still looking into the part two of the rule set, shall we say, the pathway exemption as it's currently called, considering what Emily proposed today for consideration as we talked about. Any thoughts on the process step there from RAC members? That sounds...
No, I think those are the right steps, Max. I just, I want to be really clear with the RAC that to move the exposure from 500 to 100 and not change anything else will destroy Oregon business that manage these materials. So we've got, we presented one way, the pathway thing that's in the rule right now at 500 works, right, for now. But trying to ratchet that down to 100 and not take credit and the real world situation and the protections that landfills afford is going to be a major issue for Oregon business. So
thank you, Jim. Andrea, you came off camera. You have something to say?
I did. Thank you, Max. So again, Andrea, with the Oregon Refuse and Recycling Association, just wanting to make sure that on that medical waste exemption, we are reviewing the existing language, but I heard a lot of good comments and thoughts today, especially from OHA and DEQ. So wanting to make sure how we're going to have that conversation, if we need a conversation, if people are submitting, multiple comments on what that draft language should look like around the medical exemption. So I think kind of leaving that to Odo as to, what that may look like, or if we need to come together or a subset for additional conversations around that.
Yeah, that comes, thanks, Andrea. How about this as a concept? I think what you just said is probably a good idea. If there are multiple suggestions on language that maybe don't align or we just want to kind of talk through, we could certainly call together a subset of the RAC members plus Odo staff to talk about what that language might look like before going to FSEC. The Medical Waste Subcommittee.
Great.
Or something like that.
Thank you. And we'll just stay tuned for, the next iteration and then the timeline and, be prepared to work within that.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Thank you for that. When I was talking with Tom Jackman, who's the FSEC rulemaking coordinator, we were considering going to FSEC in July. They meet, FSEC meets the third week, roughly the third week of every month, most every month, not every month, but most months, to get material, and they want the material 2 weeks ahead of those meetings. So that puts us, considering the 4th of July holiday, probably towards the end of June with a draft of whatever documents would be going to FSEC at that time, just for consideration. So here we are, April 24th. So we've got, roughly 2 months to get that together, to keep that schedule. Okay. Thank you. Anybody else have anything to say here on any of the topics? No? Okay. So the next thing you'll see from us will be an email. It'll probably come from Tom Jackman, our point of contact with rulemaking. And it'll be, like I just said, some revised draft of the rules, and we'll be in touch on the process here. in the interim, if anybody has any particular issues or questions or concerns, you certainly feel free to reach out to us directly, email or phone or however you wish. And we're always willing to talk. RAC members, again, thank you very much for the time, for the effort, for the good work here. Really appreciate it. And members of the public, thank you for calling in as well. Hope it was informative and helpful too. Thanks, everybody. We'll close it off here, pretty close to on schedule. Appreciate the time and the efforts, and we'll be in touch. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Okay,
Thanks, Max.
bye now.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.